Hi everyone, welcome to Sew Against the Grain. My name is Mona. I hope you're well. Do you like this dress? Would you like to see how I made it, including the bias tape at the neckline and the sleeves? If so, stay tuned and this video will walk you through how I made this dress. The fabric I'm using for this dress is a cotton lawn, which is a red and white gingham. I purchased the fabric from fabric.com and will include a link in the description box. We are starting by trimming the fabric along the straight of grain. Typically on sturdy fabrics, I will snip the selvage and tear the fabric to find a straight edge, but because this fabric is yarn dyed, meaning the threads are dyed before weaving, as opposed to the pattern being printed on top of the fabric, the gingham pattern follows the weft, so I just cut along the pattern. For this dress, I'm using the by hand London Anna dress bodice and adding a gathered dirndl skirt to make it look more vintage. I'm starting out by placing the bodice front pattern onto the fabric and cutting it out. I place the center front in the middle of a red stripe. To pattern match the front, I flip the partially cut out bodice over onto itself and match the pattern across both sides. For the bodice back, I placed the center back seam minus the 5/8 inch seam allowance onto the red stripe and cut one side out. I then flipped the piece I cut over onto the fabric and cut out a mirror image. Each skirt piece is 29 inches long. This is the same way I construct all my gathered skirts. I lay the fabric out flat and cut a straight line from selvage to selvage at 29 inches. Skirts are less full when I use 45-inch fabric or more full when I use a fabric that is wider. This gingham is 54 inches wide, which will make for a fuller skirt. I cut a front piece and a back skirt piece. The back skirt piece will be cut in half vertically in order to insert the zipper. Because the fabric is yarn dyed, I just followed the pattern of the gingham, but generally I snip the selvage at 29 inches and rip the fabric in order to get a straight skirt. This type of rectangle skirt is called a dirndl and is usually gathered or pleated to fit a bodice. Next, we mark the pleats in the bodice front and the darts in the bodice back. I used tailor's chalk and have snipped and poked holes in the pattern in order to transfer marks to the fabric. I connect the pattern marks with a ruler. I always stay stitch the necklines of blouses and dresses. It does wonders with preventing necklines from stretching during construction. I'm starting on the bodice back and sewing a line of stitching inside the seam allowance from the shoulder to the center back stitching at the start and end. The bodice front stay stitching starts at the shoulder and goes to the center front, then starts again at the other shoulder and meets the first line of stitching at the center front, overlapping slightly. Now for pinning and stitching the bodice darts and pleats. The pleats on the front bodice are formed by bringing two lines together, pinning them through both sides, then stitching along that line, back stitching at both ends. There are 4 pleats in the bodice front. The darts on the bodice back are formed by bringing the two sides of the long triangle together, pinning, and stitching along the line, sewing off the fabric at the point of the triangle and leaving a long tail thread. It's important to not backstitch at the tip of a dart. You will see me tie the 2 long thread tails together, securing the end of the dart and preventing any bubbling of the fabric. I clip the threads and press the darts and pleats towards the center of the garment. The bodice sides and shoulder seams are sewn. After sewing, I finish the seams with my serger and press them towards the back of the dress. Now on to bias tape. I used the scraps of fabric I had left over from cutting out the bodice pattern. I folded the selvage over onto the fabric so that it was at a 90-degree angle, forming a triangle. The fold is the bias of the fabric. I used a ruler to cut off a tiny bit of fabric from the fold, leaving me with 2 bias edges of fabric. My bias tape maker makes 1/2-inch tape and requires a 1-inch strip of bias cut fabric. I use my ruler to measure and cut 1-inch strips of fabric. The individual strips of bias fabric need to be sewn together in order to create longer strips of bias tape. Instead of butting them up to each other, they should be placed at a 90-degree angle to each other and sewn diagonally. This will give you straight, flexible bias tape. Use a pin to push the end of the bias tape through the bias tape maker. Iron the bias tape into place as it exits the small end of the bias tape maker. I find that steam helps the tape keep its shape. To attach the bias tape to the dress neckline, I opened one fold of the bias tape and pinned the right side of the tape to the wrong side of the dress neckline. We are going to flip the bias tape over to the outside of the bodice so it is visible while wearing. Stitch along the fold of the bias tape around the neckline. You should be looking at the wrong side of the bodice and the wrong side of the bias tape here. After attaching the tape, flip it out to the right side of the bodice and pin it down. The fold of the bias tape will be right at the edge of the neckline. You should be looking at the right side of the bodice and the right side of the bias tape here. Pin it down and top stitch the bottom edge. Bias tape will stretch and flex around the curves of the neckline, which is why it's so awesome for techniques like this. Once the neckline is finished, give it a press. To add the decorative bias tape to the neckline, I put the bodice on my dress form and started pinning the tape where I thought it looked good. I pinned right into the dress form for this step. I saw this general twisty neckline on Instagram on a ready-to-wear blouse. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the photo again, but that blouse was inspiration for this neckline decoration. After getting the tape where I wanted it, I removed the pins from the just form and pinned the bias tape to the bodice so that I could remove it. To sew the bias tape on the bodice, I top stitched both edges. After stitching, give the neckline a good press. I followed the same process used for adding bias tape to the neckline to add it to the sleeves. I made sure to fold over the ends of the bias tape where they overlap to ensure a clean finish on the outside. I only pinned at the start, just be sure not to stretch the tape when sewing it on. I added patch pockets that were cut on the bias to the skirt. Because the top edge of the pocket is cut on the bias, it will have a tendency to stretch with use. To prevent this, I sewed a strip of rayon seam binding along the top open edge of the pocket. Pin the seam binding to the wrong side of the top edge of the pocket, then fold that edge down 5/8 of an inch, right side to right side. You should be looking at the seam binding and the wrong side of the pocket at this point. Stitch 5/8 of an inch on both outside edges of the pocket. You only need to stitch down 5/8 of an inch from the top. Once stitched, trim the corner and turn it right side out, creating a neat top to your pocket. Top stitch along the top of the pocket, ensuring that you catch the seam binding in your stitches. Pin both pockets on the skirt front. I typically fold my skirt in half, widthwise, and then in quarters and measure down 5 inches from the 1/4 and the 3/4 marks to place my pockets. Pin them on top, pin them and top stitch the sides and bottom of your pocket. Sew the skirt side seams together. Sew 2 rows of long basting stitches along the top edge of the skirt. I sew 1 row of stitches inside the seam allowance and 1 outside of the seam allowance. Be sure to leave long thread tails on all sides. Gather the skirt to fit the bottom edge of the bodice, pin, and sew in place. Press the seam up towards the bodice. I serged both sides of the center back and the skirt bodice seam. I pinned the center back seam right sides together and sewed long basting stitches from the neckline to where the zipper would end and regular stitches from the end of the zipper to the bottom of the skirt. I pressed the back seam allowance open and pinned the zipper so that the teeth were laying right on the seam line on the inside of the dress. I seam ripped some of the basting stitches so that I could move the zipper pull out of the way for sewing. I top stitched the zipper into the center back of the dress, then seam ripped the remainder of the basting stitches. To hem the dress, I used the blind hem foot and blind hem stitch on my machine. The hem is folded up 2 inches wrong side to wrong side, pinned, then flipped over for sewing. The fence on the blind hem foot will be placed just to the right of the fold of the fabric, and most of your stitches will be on the finished end of the hem. Give it a press, and the hem is pretty dang invisible. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to include some video footage that really highlights the neckline of this dress. You can get a really close look at the finished product. If you have any questions, let me know. If you decide to make something similar with bias tape, I would love to see it. Please tag me on Instagram. And thanks so much. Bye.